Blood and the moon. Blessed be this place, more blessed still this tower. A bloody arrogant power rose out of the race, uttering mastering it. Rose like these walls from these storm-beaten cottages. In mockery I have set a powerful emblem up, and sing it rhyme upon rhyme, in mockery of a time half dead at the top. Alexandria's was a beacon tower, and Babylon's an image of the moving heavens, a logbook of the sun's journey and the moon's. And Shelley had his towers, thought's crowned powers, he called them once. I declare this tower is my symbol, I declare this winding, gyring, spiring treadmill of a stair is my ancestral stair. That Goldsmith and the Dean, Berkeley and Burke, have travelled there. Swift, beating on his breast in sibylline frenzy blind, because the heart in his blood-sodden breast had dragged him down into mankind. Goldsmith, deliberately sipping at the honey-pot of his mind, and haughtier-headed Burke that proved the state a tree, that this unconquerable labyrinth of the birds, century after century, cast but dead leaves to mathematical equality. And God appointed Berkeley that proved all things a dream, that this pragmatical, preposterous pig of a world, its Pharaoh that so solid seem, must vanish on the instant if the mind but change its theme. Saeva indignatio and the labourer's hire, the strength that gives our blood and state magnanimity of its own desire, everything that is not God consumed with intellectual fire. This is part of the poem Blood and the Moon by Yeats, William Butler Yeats, 1865 to 1939. I have a collection of prose and criticism by Yeats. It's one of the first books I ever sought out and read with commitment and passion. The inscription inside it says that I was 17 at the time I acquired it. At that time, I was a 19th century sort of mind, and I thought of Keats and Shelley as the most important poets of England. Yeats and Eliot were to me near contemporaries and could not therefore be as great as those 19th century men had been. And the Hellenizing, the mythology, the religion-founding poetry of Shelley, and likewise of Keats, dominated my imagination for several years after I began reading and wanting to write poetry or to understand who I was. Yeats gave some intellectual respectability to my desire to enter into myth and to be as irrational and self-centered as it is possible to be in those difficult times when I was a youth. I still think these days, after reading far too many studies and academic articles about writers, having read too much boring and tiring academic criticism, that when anyone writes about a poet or poetry, and even when he tries to do philosophy, which is a difficult and fine working task, he should write simply, conversationally, and just say what he thinks. In this way, by being honest and straight in your criticism, you can be of use to other people. Yeats writes in a conversational and simple way because he had no reason not to do so. And what we find in his criticism, his essays and autobiography, is a quite strange man who never willingly left mythology, religion founding, and the vast spiritual speculation typical of people like Shelley behind him. And Yeats talks of these things to us in a familiar way. He told me as a youth that his poetry is about the personal life, about his personal life. And he has told us that his self or his personal life was not something which he simply accepted as a given, but something that he struggled to control, to understand, to modify, in the environment of the supernatural. It's this supernatural aspect and this effort to become not normal which attracted me to Yeats in his prose. Given my preoccupation with what I call the self, a brief consideration of what Yeats says about this thing will be useful to me, and it could be useful to others. I'm not so concerned here with any specific poem of his. When in recent years I have returned to reading Yeats, I have been surprised at how good his late poetry is. I can read Yeats' work with pleasure any day while sitting at the table at night, and in order to while away half an hour. I can read his work with fascination about him and his problems and his grand lyrical gestures. It has long been my suspicion that with T.S. Eliot, 1889 to 1972, I think, he wrote his best poetry, and he wrote the best poetry of the last century. The two of them are the foremost poets of the 20th century in English, and they are the equivalent of what Shelley and Keats were to the preceding century, poets with whom everyone should be familiar, an inescapable destiny of the English language in the 20th century. Even in my 50s, I still consider it a pleasure to read either of them, and I find their books almost irresistible. All the Irish or American or English people who came later, to my way of looking at it, are just footnotes and variations on the things that they laid down. But I have no interest here in talking about why I feel this way by reference to any specific poem. I just hope it can be taken for granted that my admiration of Yeats' poetry is real. Both Eliot and Yeats made attempts to do theory and what you might call philosophy, and what they said in their respective attempts toward the abstractions of philosophy is also important, as alongside their poetry. Eliot is known to all conservatives, and his religious ideas are an apparently solitary effort to hold back the decadence of democracy, which was in his time carrying everything before it. Eliot trained as a philosopher at Harvard, but Yeats, on the other hand, had no academic training of any kind, and thought of his philosophical abstractions as the enemy of poetry, and therefore he seems to have consciously chosen to steer clear of philosophy, except on a couple of occasions. Nevertheless, he did put his ideas about the self, history, and ultimate reality onto paper, doing so without any compunction if and when those ideas were vague or unsupported by any argument. He knew what he believed, and he told us about it. I go back to Yeats's poetry and understand him differently, as I myself am different, and as I grow older. His essays on theory are useful as a means of understanding who he thought he was, and that is an interesting thing for me. Here, in his example, we have a very self-obsessed man, someone who had a theory of being a self, and he is telling us what he thought of himself, and what he thought about existence, and the relationship between the two of them. He put together a summary of his thoughts about self, history, and reality in his book of 1925, which he called A Vision. It is specifically for some insight into the self, by reference to the works of prose which prefigure and comment on a vision, and which explain his philosophy. It is for some insight into these things that I now write this article and present it here on YouTube. Anyone who follows me knows that I have started to put together my thoughts on becoming the Son of God, on the kingdom of heaven, and on the centrality of the concept of self to these things. And I don't think that the poet Yeats, well, I do think that the poet Yeats has some interesting things to say on these matters. Both Yeats and Eliot were what you might call self-gathering poets. One way or another, they prayed and wrote poetry which is almost meditative prayer. They practiced centering, the concentration of the self, and they had a certain negative attitude towards the world, in the Christian sense of that word. I have selected 3 pieces of writing from Yeats's prose for these purposes. Again, I'm not writing about Yeats so much as expounding my own thoughts while prodding and at him for a response. However, I will make an honest attempt to understand what he's written. Let's get some background settled about Yeats in his later period, roughly from the time of his 50th year. Around 1917, when he was 51, he met his wife. He married late. At the same time, he completed an essay describing his beliefs about himself and the importance of selfhood, called Per Amica Silentia Lunae, or Through the Friendly Silence of the Moon. I shall look at one half of this, the half entitled Anima Hominis, or Soul of Man. Shortly after writing that essay, in 1917, and 4 days after getting married, he asked his new wife to try automatic writing, with which he himself had been dabbling. And she began to do so fluently, which surprised him. Looking at what she produced while she was doing automatic writing, he believed that she was transmitting to him information from spirits. She or they were giving him information so as to compose poetry, as he understood things. "We have come to give you metaphors for poetry," is what was written down. This is explained in A Vision, Introduction, Part 2. His wife's automatic writing stated that to him. They were not giving him the information for any other reason than to provide metaphors for poetry, but nonetheless, he compiled her notes into his book of 1925, which was subsequently revised and added to. Now, the essay of 1917 prefigures A Vision, and it expands on the ideas in A Vision preemptively. In his 1928 introduction to A Vision, he refers back to the essay of 1917 in particular, singling it out as something decisive, as a moment of his self-understanding. And these 2 works, A Vision and Per Amica, do form an expression of his metaphysics. To me, A Vision, which I read a long time ago without much profit or understanding, is an attempt to find recurrent patterns in history similar to the ones made by Arnold J. Toynbee and Oswald Spengler. Spengler was writing at roughly the same time, and Toynbee, again, slightly later, but in the same era, where the discovery of this structure of history was something many people seem to have been interested in. Spengler tried to find the idea underlying any culture or civilization, and it was his theory that every culture expresses an idea. Toynbee was more empirical. He examined each civilization and tried to find not ideas underlying them, but a pattern which all of them embodied. recurrent patterns, recurrent themes. They encouraged me, however, to read history in relation to their historical logic, Yeats says about the spirits. They encouraged me to do that. And they encouraged me to read biography in relation to their 28 typical incarnations, that I might give concrete expression to their abstract thought. Introduction, Part 5. Yeats explains to Lady Gregory at the time, when he finished A Vision, that his experiences with his wife's automatic writing had made him more educated, and that they had made his poetry better, so that it had gained self-possession and power since the incredible experience. Introduction, Part 1. After looking at Anima Hominis, and with reference to some small parts of A Vision, I will comment on his 1937 essay, which is the third piece of prose which I'm interested in here, called A General Introduction to My Work, which very typically expounds what can only be called a system, because it goes so much against what everyone else seems to believe these days. I mean, his view of himself and the world is unique, so that it looks like a coherent system, even if only because it is different from what you might call the common and widely accepted system held by everyone else. So to simplify what I'm trying to say here, I'm going to look at three pieces of prose by Yeats. Firstly, the 1917 essay from Per Amica Silentia Lunae. Then, at the same time, parts of A Vision, particularly the introduction. And thirdly, an essay of 1937 which he wrote and called A General Introduction to My Work, which was intended when he wrote it 2 years before his death to be a summary of what he'd achieved in his life in poetry. Excuse me. I have said that a man must work to become a self, and that his self can be lost. I would say that if we were speaking as Christians, that the devil encourages men to take no notice of themselves. So therefore, the aim of life, and the thing which the evil one most involves himself with, consist of becoming a self, on the one hand, and there being an obstacle or an obstruction in the way of this. Yeats also considered it to be necessary to become a self, but he associated this, and he associated his true self with the person who writes the poetry. He seems to have considered himself not quite a saint or a sage, but to have allowed himself only this: the power to become a poetic personality. So he associates being a self and a real self with being a poet. His works are the personal expression of a man who is wise and passionless. His poems are written by a man who has created a certain type of self. The person who speaks in his poetry is what he would call a type. And for convenience sake, I could summarize it in simple terms as an ageless Irish man, particularly of the peasant class. The person who writes Yeats's poetry is self-consciously taking on the mask of that kind of person. He is Irish. He is of a class of peasantry, and he is arrogantly indifferent to the modern democratic world of the English. He claims to have a link to his ancestors, and this self is a heroic self. But as I say this, of course, the nature of the self which he created has more depth to it than this. which we could discover by reading his poetry. Nevertheless, the system which underlies this idea that he has of himself is what we are studying. We are asking, where do these notions come from? He proposes in his 1917 essay, in its first part, Anima Hominis, that any man has two parts. He has a real self and his anti-self. His real self is the one which is the hero. It's the one who is the poet, the man who has been born from the Irish historic tapestry. Yeats speaks of the Irish history and the Irish culture as a kind of timeless tapestry of events, pictures, from which the heroic Irishman rises to speak and may also go back into it. On the other hand, the anti-self is the one which lives in the everyday world. The anti-self is the one you could say we are familiar with when we sit down at the breakfast table, where nothing particularly coheres besides the tasks we've got to do for the day and for the rest of our life. There's no coherence to such an experience, to such a life. It is dominated and constructed around the needs of others and our obligations to various things. And he says, we make rhetoric out of our quarrel with others, while we make poetry out of our quarrel with ourself. Anima Hominis, section 5. It's interesting that I read an essay by T.S. Eliot about Rudyard Kipling. It's one of Eliot's essays on Kipling while Kipling was still alive, reviewing a new book of poetry by Kipling. And Eliot says that Kipling writes rhetoric. And like Swinburne, he compares him to Swinburne. The two of them, they basically wrote poetry which can be declaimed on a stage and impresses you while you hear it, but does not sink in. It does not arouse any kind of, it does not embody any permanent emotion. You could say that this is the kind of thing that makes Kipling a writer of verse, that his poetry is rhetoric, and it's meant to be heard, and it's meant to be a quarrel with other people. But we'll speak about Kipling another time. Poetry is a quarrel with our own self. So you could say that when you read someone's poetry, you're looking over their shoulder at notes they're making with their own self. In the Anima Hominis, in the first paragraphs, Yeats makes it plain how his real self is the very centre of all being. It is the most true thing. And he refers to Dante's La Vita Nuova, the part in which Dante sees a vision, which is his real self and his real life, when he sees the Lord of terrible aspect, who tells him, Ego Dominus Tuus, I am your master. This real, heroic self, which Dante caught a vision of as a young man, and recorded in La Vita Nuova, this real heroic self need not be a person or a gesture or a mask, but it can also be a landscape. It can be an entire world, a tapestry as it were. This is how Yeats associates the real self with visions. The real self is part of a vision and can just as easily be a landscape as a person. What is crucial is that it is imagined, and it is not drawn directly from your experiences of the senses. It's the result of a vision which comes from leaving the world and the common anti-self behind. I suppose you could say that Yeats has already assumed that the world is not all that there is, and that the imagination has equal importance for any human being. And that he is already in a conflict with empirical experience. Yeats makes surprising numbers of references to Dante, whose poetry in the Divine Comedy is a vast vision of the other world, of course. And this fascinated Yeats by the looks of it. When he's writing prose, especially about his theory of poetry, Dante is never far away. He refers to Dante again as an important part of his 1937 general introduction to his work, when he announces his lifelong religious and metaphysical belief. I should take the opportunity to quote this reference in full, because in this 1937 summary of what his poetry is, he lays out his creed, as it were. He says, "I was born into this faith, have lived it, and shall die in it. My Christ, a legitimate deduction from the creed of St. Patrick, as I think, is that unity of being which Dante compared to a perfectly proportioned human body. It is Blake's imagination, what the Upanishads have named the self. Nor is this unity distant and therefore intellectually understandable, but rather it is immanent, differing from man to man and age to age, taking upon itself pain and ugliness, eye of newt, toe of frog." His notion of God, of Christ, is the perfect unity of the human being, and associated with the imagination, as understood by Blake. And it is what the Upanishads of the Hindu culture name the self. It's not something you can understand, it's something that you are, but it differs from age to age. This aspect of it differing historically from age to age is, of course, what a vision is about. In Per Amica and Anima Hominis from 1917, which I will just now concentrate on, he brings to bear empirical observations from his experience of people to prove that there are two selves in everyone. The one we generally live with, which he calls the antithetical self, which is chaotic and is no more than an anti-self. And then there's the real one. And I've made a mistake here because there's a little bit of a confusion. Our everyday self is the anti-self. It's chaotic, it's fractured, it's meaningless, it strays from one thing to another, has no substance. But then there's the real self, which is also called the antithetical self, the real one, which is what his poetry gives expression to in his case. In order to give rise to this real self, Yeats says that he has to be alone for a start, and he has to fall silent with himself. This is the process by which he starts writing poetry. The real self is not a standard thing, not a universal type which falls upon everyone. Men are each different and unique. Rather, the real self is a thing of dream and vision in each case, in each individual man. Among Christian saints, the phantasmagorical visionary self, the real self, is Christ. And each saint tries to embody Christ in his own life. The saint, as I myself have frequently said, lives among the world as among nothing but dust. The world is changed into a featureless dust and can be run through with the fingers. A Vision, Book 5, Section 4. But his imagination of himself as Christ, as God, is his real self and his real world. A man must turn from the mirror, which you can see every day, you can pass it, you can imagine yourself in this physical form, and he must turn towards the mask. Putting on a mask changes the world around one. Looking from the eye holes of a mask makes him part of a drama. It changes the world, alters its quality. And this is the activity of imagination, of course. The concept of the mask is quite simply what it says it is. It's a put on something which covers your face. But this would be done by the poet in a symbolic way. It doesn't actually put on a physical mask, but the change in the world and the change in your character is the same. He calls this true self the daimon, from a word which Shelley used, meaning spirit, which is from the Greek. The self brings about a destiny, the real self being coherent and concentrated and focused. That self alone has a destiny, a story which has a start and a finish. The self gathers the person into the centre of his own story. When he becomes his true self, the man becomes his own daimon, the opposite of his anti-self. And to summarise briefly, Yeats also mulls over in this essay whether a man's love of beauty in a woman is likewise the love of what is opposite. I think that this is what he means, that when a man refuses to become his true self because he lacks the energy or the inclination, he can still see his opposite, he can still find his opposite, an approximation to his real self, in the physical sexual love for a woman who is his opposite too. For, to quote, "It may be that sexual love, which is founded upon spiritual hate, is an image of the warfare of man and daimon." If a man fails to become his real self, he can still find the visionary, imaginary satisfaction in a beautifully attractive woman. As can be seen in comments I've made about St. Matthew's Gospel recently, I think a man finds himself in the kingdom of heaven when he is broken and when he seeks the yoke, which is easy, comes from the other world, which leads to the other world. The kingdom of heaven, I do not say I agree with this, is what Yeats would call the antithetical self, the vision, the imagination of Blake. So we would associate the kingdom of heaven with this in Yeats. Here are some pointers for further reflection on this matter. The saint and the sage alone have found a lasting true self, Yeats says. In the saint or the sage, the passions must be broken, and they will ideally turn, after they've been broken, into visions alone. Yeats seems to have held it as a principle that when a passion, such as love or anger or hatred, reaches its very summit and does not find any other release, then it will simply it will just vanish and crack, and it will become a vision. And this is the kind of thing which he wants to write when he writes his poetry. So his poetry is a sight of calmness and of the kind of the desolation and the peace after the activity of life, after the passion. The poet, unable to attain that high perfection of the saint, will rise to it and then fall again, to be broken again and again. And being less spiritually powerful than the saint, he will never hold on to the real self indefinitely. The poet is a lower form of man, so to speak, and the different types of man and the different types of power is what the metaphysics of a vision is essentially about, as we've said. Again, If attaining this real self, we become interested in ourselves, our mundane objectives, in our mundane, the person you can see in the mirror, we pass out of the vision, just as in meditation, as I've said. There must be no pride or objective, no aim to this self-creation, which yields to vision. Yeats himself says that while he is in a state of poetic composition, while he's in the state of being this heroic Irishman who has no passion but has vision, if he starts to think of himself as the Yeats who was born in 1865 and died in 1939, then the vision is lost. And this is the same in what I've described as meditation and self-gathering. You can't meditate while you're interested in your own fate or any kind of gain or objective. Here are two quotations regarding these points, particularly pertaining to the saint and the sage, which would be the perfection of the real self. He says, "The saint alone is not deceived, neither thrusting with his shoulder nor holding out unsatisfied hands. He would climb without wondering to the antithetical self of the world. He is the Indian, narrowing his thought in meditation, or driving the world away in contemplation. He is the Christian copying Christ. He is the antithetical self of the classic world. For a hero loves the world until it breaks him, and the poet loves the world until it has broken his faith. But while the world is yet debonair, the saint even then has turned away. And because he renounced experience itself, he will wear his mask as he finds it." Yeats proposes that there is the self, which is real, and the anti-self, which is more common and is the type of self which we're familiar with in a chaotic way. He also posits the world, and then this other thing which is more properly understood as a field for the mask and the imagination, for the phantasmagoria. Yeats is quite plain about this too, that the world, as the newspapers and the law might understand it, is not really real. It's not intelligible in any other way than as a mechanical and meaningless process. He says, "I'm convinced that in 2 or 3 generations it will become generally known that the mechanical theory has no reality, that the natural and supernatural are knit together, that to escape a dangerous fanaticism we must study a new science. At that moment, Europeans may find something attractive in a Christ posed against a background not of Judaism but of Druidism, not shut off in dead history, but flowing, concrete, phenomenal," from his general introduction. Notice that he claims that in a couple of generations it should be generally known that the mechanical theory of Newton, Darwin, and so on is not real, but rather that the world is should be understood as something supernatural as well as natural. He also associates Christianity with Druidism. The merely mechanical world, bereft of vision, because it's the vision which he wants to bring to bear on our account of the world. That world, mechanical world, without any impetus to find itself in a higher, unique form, which relates to the self, is to him, the mechanical world is to him an aberration, a historical nightmare. And I take the opportunity to cite another of his predictions in the same essay, because he does, in his last year or two, he seems to have made these 2 grand predictions. He says, "When I stand upon O'Connell Bridge in the half-light and notice that discordant architecture, all those electric signs where modern heterogeneity has taken physical form, a vague hatred comes up out of my own dark and I'm certain that wherever in Europe there are minds strong enough to lead others, the same vague hatred rises. In 4 or 5 or in less generations, this hatred will have issued in violence and imposed some kind of rule of kindred. He says that the rule of kindred must emerge out of the hatred which the modern man feels about his environment and the world that we've created, the merely mechanical, heterogeneous world. The world which is not part of the self is heterogeneous, and it makes the natural man full of hate, and that the replacement must be some kind of rule of kindred. And what he means by that is, you might call it simple terms, a nationalism, the rule of the family, of your ancestors and of your descendants, which is not heterogeneous and is located inside which is a result of being self, being a real self. This points us towards Yeats's belief that the heroic self, whose passion is broken and turned into a vision, which is the real self, is also a kindred and racial memory. It's a mask worn for the sake of a people, a nation. It's possible to be a self on behalf of a nation. His first teachers in poetry, he recalls, were not separated individual men. They spoke or tried to speak out of a people, to a people. Behind them stretched the generations. In that same late essay, he repeatedly expresses his dislike of Wordsworth, William Wordsworth, born in 1770, died in the middle of the 19th century. That Wordsworth, who refused to wear a mask, refused to allow himself to be part of any drama, of any destiny. And Yeats associates Wordsworth with modernity, with the machine view of reality, and, above all, with the English. Wordsworth is the typical English man. Of Christ's law, which finalizes and perfects the old law, he says that it is, or he understands Christ's law to be essentially love. And love only applies to the individual, for love is love of what is unique. Christ demands each man is individual and self-finding. And love is intellectual. And it does not inspire or demand action in the world. To quote him, he says, "And it belongs to contemplation, not to action. For we would not change that which we love." Vision, Book 5, Section 4. Just to stick to Christian themes for 1 second. He also says that faith is the highest perfection of the human mind. Faith is its highest offering and gift. It is the only gift man can make to God. Therefore, it must be offered in sincerity. It must be offered in sincerity. I draw attention to these statements to summarize the point that Yeats was not exactly an Orthodox Christian. There are various reasons why he could not be so, particularly because he was convinced that history develops in a certain supernatural way, and that there are 28 phases of the history and 28 types of man, which is not an Orthodox Christian idea. And this idea is something other than, that it does imply that there is something other than God or man at work, which determines how the relationship between God and man happens. Yeats's admiration for the pre-Catholic Western type of Christianity, when Easter was celebrated on the first full moon following the equinox, points to what we would call an alliance with ethno-nationalism. And this precludes a strictly correct Christian faith. With the pre-Catholic Western Christianity, we are dealing with Christianity which can have some sort of commerce with Druidism. This is what Yeats is getting at. Yeats was not so much an Irish nationalist as an avatar of Ireland itself, and he felt that he could not renounce his poetic destiny, so he could not become a full believing Christian because he had these obligations to his being the hero and the avatar of Ireland itself. He likes to conflate Christianity with Druidism for that same reason. I don't know what Druidism is personally, but he claims to do so. And I'm also interested to return to my own concerns and make some notes, which is what I will now do. Yeats does not exactly give any greater precision to what the self is than what I have said here in this essay. Yeats did not sit down and work out, piece by piece, line by line, a demonstration and description of selfhood. He simply asserted that, in his experience, when the self and the passions were expended, and when he became his real antithetical self, he had visions, and that it's equivalent to wearing a mask. What I've described in this article is, I believe, a summary of what Yeats has said about selfhood. So it's not as if I'm going to find any points about selfhood and meditation which can be used in arguments, nor is there any deep psychology. But he has proposed a general theory of the two types of self and how they interact with the imagination, and how they are, or at least one of them, is opposed to the world. He has said that the poet is not a man, but rather a passion, and more of a type than a passion, because he becomes the type when his passion is broken. And we could say that the personal type which Yeats took on, the mask, is the rambling peasant poet. And he thought of this as a national archetype, as opposed to the Wordsworth English type. To quote him, he says, "No people hate as we do, in whom the past is always alive. There are moments when hatred poisons my life, and I accuse myself of effeminacy because I have not given it adequate expression. It's not enough to have put into the mouth of a rambling peasant poet. This is Irish hatred and solitude, the hatred of human life that made Swift write Gulliver and write the epitaph on his tomb, which can still make us wag between extremes and doubt our sanity. Final remarks about further remarks about the self. I suppose that what I mean by self is the same as Yeats means by that word, in a vague sort of way, but there ought not to be a harsh definition of the self, perhaps, anyway, since it is simple and single. We simply have to assume it. We have to declare it. And if we're dealing with personal experience, which is what both Yeats and I myself have seen is necessary, then the field of proofs and arguments is not open to us, because each man has only his own self, and we simply have to assume that the person we're talking to doesn't deny that they have such a self. It only needs a practical demonstration in an individual instance that there should be a self. It does not need to be something gigantic and complex, suitable for fine definition, which can be transmitted across all people so that they would all assent and agree to it. In each case, it's unique. I mean by the word self, the concentrated point of consciousness which has no object, which is outside the constraints of time and space, body and distraction. And I think that this is the same kind of thing which Yeats meant, where you cross over from the anti-self to the real self. It's the message of Christ to attain that state, to become your real self. And Christ is God in man, and therefore the self is God. And I don't mean in the transcendental Emersonian sense either, of Ralph Waldo Emerson. In Emerson, in the American tradition of philosophy, God is everywhere and in everyone and everything. And this is what they call transcendentalism. Rather, what I mean is that the individual in his simplicity, but not with his ideas and attitudes, his opinions and his point of view about the world. I do not mean Christ as the activist and healer in the world and the moral teacher. I mean that the self would be God, and I'm putting no greater precision on it than this, in the sense that Blake said that God was the imagination and Christ was the imagination, and that the imagination is something that we also share in as individuals, as an individual. I'll put no more precise point on it than that, but to say that the self in some way which is currently hard to express and understand is God, which is kind of like what you mean when you say that a Christian shall be the son of God or the brother of Christ and so on. If we were to ask, what is this interiority of the self, which Christ also taught, we should reply, it is being with God. And God as a person. Not God as everywhere and everything, but rather, just as the self is a person, that God is a person. I am, as I think everybody should be who has a real self, jealous of my contact with God. And the self is therefore, to me, alone of any importance in the world, in existence. Like Yeats, and as he says, as Swift did, we despise the world naturally. The world to me is a desert or a quarry, and it could as easily be nothing as it is something. That's what I really think. That the self is the intimate friend of God, and after being broken, after its retreat from the world. And in this, Yeats and I agree. I also grow to realise that the self, in its travelling to another stage, leaving the anti-self behind, becoming its antithetical self, has obstacles which perhaps Yeats did not accept. Namely, some force of interference and evil, what you could call the devil. The world is the open space where the devil arouses our hatred. The evil one, to be straightforward, is what stops you from being a self. And like God, the evil takes place inside rather than in physical objects outside us. I would suggest that the logical necessity of the Trinity, the tripartite God, is required by any such mysticism as I'm expressing here, since we do also nevertheless have to submit to living in the world in some way. And therefore we are always dual or threefold ourselves. We have a real self, we have the anti-self, and we have the world and the vision. Nevertheless, there is only one self, and so there must be only one God. So we have this dialectic interplay of the Trinity, three persons of God, and yet the unity. Self-centering and gathering is the still point of consciousness where God speaks to us and communicates. And the personal life is the field for that activity, outside the observation of other people. When we ask, however, what is the world and what are other people, we can say this, because I've just pointed out that they're nothing. But we can say this. It is also, on the contrary, the creative gift of God on an infinite scale to us. You could say that we have imagination, but that God has creation of the world. So while we can claim to be sons of God and we can attempt entry into the kingdom, into the imagination, as Yeats might put it, we have no power at all by comparison with God and his creation. The world, whether as imagination or as machine outside us, which is the common view of it, let's remember, is the field of self where we have to live, and God created that for us. Fortunately, or unfortunately for philosophy and the common understanding between us, the place where we have to talk to one another and try to explain who we are and what we believe, as men, we also have to say that God speaks in single instances to one person alone, uniquely to each man in his solitude, and not to anyone else. It's in this sense that it's quite easy for somebody to shout in the marketplace that there's no God, and to easily for men to gather together and start smiling and laughing as the four horsemen of the apocalypse did in England about 20 years ago, and say, there's no God. It's easy to say that because God acts with each person alone. And you can't compel him to show public miracles which the four horsemen would have taken an interest in. God has freedom to approach us or not, and follows no rule. If one had to choose a mask or a destiny in this world on this basis, and the basis that we've left everything behind, on the basis that we treat the world as dust which just passes through our fingers, as the saint or the sage see things, then the mask that we would wear if we were the saint or the sage would be kind of indifferent and irrelevant. It would be whatever we find it to be. It would depend on the individual saint or sage. He should simply act ethically in this world. But it has been typical for men of that kind, if they have to wear a mask, to attempt to imitate Christ as he lived on the earth in their day-to-day behaviour. Which brings us back to the normal world again, and where I'm going to end this essay. So thank you for listening.